The 1800s, a century with lots of development and technological innovations along with conflict and vast social changes. We have so many clues from this particular century. Today we're going to explore the strange events of the 1800s.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
So the first event we'll look at is the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. At least that's what the official history tells us. The Napoleonic Wars are interesting because we start the century off with a vast series of conflicts, primarily centered in Europe, although it should be noted that these conflicts occurred across the land and the sea. Indeed, if you ever watched Master and Commander, that ship battle was set around South America. We see many different depictions, though, of Napoleon, and in the past, the channel explored the concept of Napoleon being some sort of reset commander who decided to go against the grain and try to establish himself as a leading authority figure. There are many oddities about this conflict, though, including the ability to defy logistical limitations. Now, what's interesting about the Napoleonic Wars is they occurred after the initial start of what we're told is the Industrial Revolution. It was also the first attempt at nations to engage in mass mobilization or conscripting very large armies. And these armies they were somehow able to sustain because we're told that the Industrial Revolution had improved agricultural capacity. Napoleon was a bit of a maverick character, and the official history says that, and I suspect that what the true account is, if Napoleon did exist, is that he's a bit of a maverick character as well. Yet in the recent movie that we saw, Napoleon looked anything but interested in whatever he was doing, and of course that's just the creative choices of the movie, which I found rather interesting. And we certainly know that Joaquin Phoenix is a great actor, but when you contrast that with some of the images that we have in Napoleon, we certainly see a vast difference. We're led to believe by the official historical account that Napoleon was a very charismatic figure, and he was very engaging, and he was also a military genius. And yet in the film, we find out that the love of his life, Josephina, was his main concern, although it should be noted that when she was seducing him, he looked like he couldn't be even more disinterested. But again, creative choices in the movie. Yet in many of these other images that we see of him, he is this very inspiring commander, and he managed to unify France during a time of vast social change and revolution. Of course, it led to a very bloody conflict, and for whatever reason, the most interesting thing about the Napoleonic Wars is, once the conflict ended, Napoleon was not imprisoned, he was not executed for starting wars that killed millions of people. He was simply sent away, initially to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, where he was allowed to live in comfort. He escaped from the island and started another war, and was defeated yet again. And so he was exiled, this time to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic, the southern Atlantic, in one of the most remote locations on Earth. Yet, of course, they still gave him a nice mansion to live out his days in. Now imagine if the guy from World War II with the mustache had ended up like that. Imagine if they'd given him some nice retirement villa after World War II in some South American nation. I wonder how well that would have been received. Many questions, though, about the Napoleonic conflict, and many conflicting accounts, and I'm not here to lampoon the movie. I've done that in other explorations. I just find the creative decisions interesting, and we know that everyone who was involved with the film was very creatively inspired, and there were great performers. It should be noted that we do have some images of soldiers dressing up in uniforms from that particular time frame, although what the authenticity of these actual photos are is left to the imagination. I'd imagine a uniform like that would get a little warm, especially in the summer days going across Europe, but you never know. I mean, at least you look really cool and you've got many different aspects to your uniform. So that's the Napoleonic Wars. Let's go to the year without a summer, 1816. The year without a summer, the eruption of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia, which caused the entire area and sky of the land to be blanketed with ash, and as a result it reduced the sunlight reaching the land and caused a vast drop in temperatures, and as the title implies, it was the year without the summer. Is that really what transpired, though? And here we have the comparison of different volcanoes, and Mount Tambora is one of the biggest in recorded human history in terms of cubic miles of ejecta. Nice word there, ejecta. And what we're told is that this eruption caused an entire layer of volcanic ash to stop the sun from penetrating, and it greatly disrupted the seasons. Oddly enough, though, when you try to corroborate this with local accounts and news and history at the time, it's a little bit of a conflicting account because it seems to affect some areas more than others, and certainly we can make that conclusion that that's always the case when we have an event such as this. There's different aspects of artwork, and it should even be noted that this Year Without a Summer even influenced Mary Shelley to tell her little story about Frankenstein, which endures to this day. What really transpired, though, with this Year Without a Summer? Is this exactly what happened and why? Or was this because of other causes and other events? Is this because this eruption was actually something else that happened that changed the nature of the landscape? Indeed, one of the recurring challenges that we have, according to the official history in the 1800s, is the vast changes in weather. Although what's interesting is that we're told that there was a little bit of a cold period that supposedly ended in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and yet you'll find later that we have a recurrence of cold periods throughout the entire century, from 1800 to 1899. We have many paintings that show us that there were great hardships as a result of this Year Without a Summer. We're told that there were many lives lost because of famines due to the crop losses. We're also told that there were other complications. And yet, oddly enough, as I said earlier, when you try to actually compare and contrast many of these accounts that were contemporaneous from this time frame, they're very conflicting. It seems as though this disaster was felt in some areas more than others, and as I've said, there's nothing odd about that. That's entirely possible. But where the oddities come into play is some of the observations that you have of what was really occurring at that time. Changes of observations in the sky, changes of actual crop yields, and the true effect of this Year Without a Summer. One thing that's interesting is you would think that this would have a great crippling effect on the nascent United States as a nation, as the United States had just come out of the War of 1812 and was still a relatively new nation. And yet, it does not appear to have been negatively affected by this Year Without a Summer. What do you think this event was, and what was really going on, and why do we have so many conflicting accounts? And now we go to the New Madrid Earthquake in 1811, the greatest earthquake recorded in North America, and oddly enough, near Missouri, New Madrid, Missouri specifically, and yet we're told that very few people died. A very horrific earthquake that is even reputed to have caused the mighty Mississippi to flow backwards. Now again, this is another questionable event. What exactly was going on? Was this just a random earthquake? And of course, as you can see, we have all of the plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and we shouldn't question the plaques because nobody would actually put the money to put up things that aren't true or didn't really happen. And there's no doubt that something happened, and we're told that it was a magnitude 7.2 earthquake in New Madrid, Missouri, and the effects were felt everywhere. Yet, oddly enough, no loss of life, but vast damage of many structures, and don't you find that interesting? So, if there weren't a lot of people living there, then what structures were actually damaged? Well, again, just don't think about it too much. We have a historical account, and we know that it was a very terrible earthquake, and even though we have plenty of first-hand accounts of the Mississippi flowing backwards and many other odd observations from the time frame, what do you think the New Madrid earthquake actually represented and what was going on? The New Madrid fault line, which we're told is still active, although it hasn't really been active since this earthquake in 1811. And certainly if there were any tremors or earthquakes that have occurred, we'd hear about it. The revolutions of 1848. The revolutions of 1848 revolved around social change, ostensibly centered in Europe, although it seems as though it occurred across the land. And what we're told is that the people had grown tired of being under the rule of monarchs and other difficult situations and the authoritarian rules that they employed in Europe at that time. And therefore, many of the people in the working classes decided to rise up and rebel against their monarch governments and many of the other authoritarian regimes that were going on at the time. Now, the official history tells us that this period of uprising was very bloody, and officially what had happened was that the revolutions were put down by the monarch governments at the time. Although on a longer timeline, what ended up happening was certain individuals such as Otto von Bismarck and what would become the nation of Germany, they did give concessions to the desire of the citizenry to actually have more rights. At least that's what we're told. And it's a very odd account. What was really going on? Was this really a grassroots social revolution that occurred in 1848? Or was this something else? Because it's interesting to note just how many years in the 1800s were actually filled with conflict. External conflict, internal conflict, and yet, oddly enough, none of these nations ever seem to have any issue with mobilizing their vast military resources or even logistically sustaining them, whether they were on expeditionary campaigns across far seas or whether they were fighting their own citizens in an internal conflict or a quote-unquote civil war, which we've talked about quite extensively on the channel. But what did these social revolutions really point to? And did these leaders really actually represent the desires of the people, or were they simply giving the people what their desires were? The revolutions were put down, but since they were called revolutions over a long enough timeline, they were considered successful. So even in the historicity of these social revolutions of 1848, we have a conflicting account. The governments prevailed and put down the armed insurrection, as it were, but the desires and the aims of the people to actually achieve a greater set of freedoms, or let's be honest, it was actually liberties that they were looking for, because when you operate in a society, you only have liberty, you don't actually have freedom. And they had achieved some of the liberties that they were looking for. Although this didn't stop many people from emigrating to the United States from many of these nations where they felt oppression, and there were other issues that were going on. We can refer to many isolated instances of people that simply didn't have enough to sustain themselves, such as the potato famine in Ireland. And there's many other examples. The artwork from this period reflects a very brutal conflict, and we see a lot of siege battles, and we see many great assaults that gives us the impression that this was a much more brutal conflict. It's also intriguing to note some of the wondrous architecture that we have that was already available in the 1800s. It's yet another one of these major events from the 1800s that causes us to question what was really going on. The 1800s population bomb, namely in the United States. We look at how fast the population growth occurred in the United States, and we have a separate exploration on that. But across the entire lands, we're told the population didn't really grow that much. And yet, once again, you have conflicting accounts. And as we ascertain, the population of the United States itself grew over 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. And then we have certain United States cities where the population grew 200,000% in a 100-year period, such as Seattle from 1860 to 1960. So again, what was really going on? We have many accounts, especially in the United States, of vast population growth. It just feels like you're on a ride and they're constantly revising things. The Orphan Trains, 1850, well, did they ever really stop? That's certainly debatable. The odd thing about the Orphan Trains, which we've explored extensively on the channel, is it seems to be a redistribution of population, or as we speculated when we did the initial explorations, it seemed to be a diaspora of children, moving them out and spreading them out from where their original homeland actually was. Now, we're told that there were very benevolent and altruistic reasons for doing this. We had children who were stuck in the cities, although it just really seemed to apply to New York City and not all the cities on the United States eastern seaboard. There were also accounts of the orphan trains occurring in other nations across the land. And while the initial impression is that this only applied to one particular social group or nationality of children, it actually applied to all groups of children, if you do a little bit more looking and investigating in terms of what actually happened. But we have children that were spread out all across the land in many different locations, and the reason I put the question mark in terms of not knowing when this ended is who's to say that this really ended, as we still have orphans from current conflicts who get spread out to different lands. Now, it may be true that this is for an altruistic purpose, and we're legitimately trying to help these children. You can find no shortage of public broadcasting specials where they have veterans of the orphan trains who are interviewed, and they talk about how wonderful their experience was, and the family that adopted them treated them very well. And I have no doubt that that's the case, but it's just odd that we have this very positive image of children that were, in many cases, taken from their families, their rightful families, as there's many cases of the one parent that was still alive in the 1800s, and the children were taken away from them and then sent around to other areas in the country. Was there something much more insidious going on? And the orphan trains is another one of those great examples from the 1800s that there seemed to be a lot more going on than what the official history tells us. One of the real purposes of this exploration, though, is I'm looking to detail some of the evidence that we have in the mainstream account that enables us to construct our theories in terms of what really happened. Now, at the end of this exploration, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say exactly what the mainstream tells us in terms of doing this, because only two types of people are allowed to really ascertain what's actually going on in the land, and those people are scientists and historians. They're the only ones who can tell you if you're in a conspiracy, and you may get spun around and thrown around and you're not really sure what's going on. Victoria to the USA, 1800 to 1900. In the 1800s, we had what was called the Victorian era in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, as it were at the time, and that was the time when they said that the sun didn't set on the British Empire. And indeed, the British Army was second to none in the world, at least according to the official history, and they had a lot of ability to project military capacity across the land. Although the situation in Great Britain after the Industrial Revolution is conflicted. We have numerous accounts of child labor and very difficult labor conditions, and that was part of what led to some of the social revolutions that we talked about in 1848. We also have a very conflicted account of society. We have a great group of haves and have-nots, and this actually reached its culmination point in some of the writings of H.G. Wells when he posited that the class division would lead to separate evolutionary paths on humanity. Ah, yes, evolution. That's always a good one to consider. Where they ended up in his novel The Time Machine, the workers becoming the Morlocks, or creatures that lived underground for hundreds of thousands of years, and the Eloi, or the descendants of the people that lived the Victorian lifestyle of being the higher class. Of course, people say that H.G. Wells didn't know that the middle class would develop. Queen Victoria is an interesting character, as most individuals of monarchy are, and we're told that she actually reached her Diamond Jubilee, one of the few monarchs to do so. We also have many other accounts of what life was actually like during that time frame, and while you have the great Victorian parties and many well-dressed people, you also have these accounts of very unfortunate labor conditions and slums that are all over the place. Yet, oddly enough, during the same time frame, you also have accounts of housing being constructed across Great Britain and in Scotland, where many of these tenements managed to endure to this day. The challenge was, though, in the 1960s when they began new urban development programs in places such as Scotland, they didn't exactly know what they're doing, at least that's what the official history says, and so they ended up displacing many people and putting them into large tower residences that didn't exactly work out so well. There's a little film from the late 90s called Ratcatcher which depicts this quite well, and naturally it stars Tommy Flanagan. And then the Victorian time frame and the British were supplanted by the United States, the nascent nation of the United States, which became a world power. And the event which official history tells us that prompted that was the Spanish-American War. And we just looked at the wreckage of the USS Maine, which was sunk in Cuba by supposedly the Spanish, because Cuba was a Spanish possession at that time. And the United States got drawn into the conflict, or rather incited the conflict, depending on your view of history. And the United States engaged in what they called a splendid little war against Spain, and as a result, Cuba was liberated from Spain and became its own nation, and the United States acquired numerous colonial possessions, even though the United States was not supposed to be a nation that was interested in acquiring colonial possessions, namely the Philippines, which would go on to play a very significant role during World War II. It's very odd, though, to consider how the United States in just 100 short years had gone from being a nascent backwater nation to becoming a world power. And many historians agree that the Spanish-American War was when the United States had become a world power. Suddenly, it had managed to master the aspects of the expeditionary military approach, it built a navy overnight, and it also began to employ a national army. To what we have today, where the United States is the only military that actually divides up all the known lands into geographical areas of responsibility called combatant commands. And it seems that without a doubt that this transition of power, or at least the overt exercising of military power, was complete at the end of World War II, where the United States would be the primary practitioner of military campaigns across the land. Many of the battles from the Spanish-American War are very interesting to consider, whether you're looking at the battles that occurred in Cuba or in the Philippines. It's an odd comparison of naval actions with land actions, and whether you're looking at the exploits of Admiral Dewey or Teddy Roosevelt himself, you have this odd theme with the United States military where it seems that adventurers are always very successful. And yet you compare and contrast that with some of the earlier failed American military adventures, especially in the War of 1812. And here we have Teddy Roosevelt himself giving a very rousing speech to one of the oddities that occurred after the Spanish-American War, the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was supposed to be a showcase of the new American military power, at least in the Navy, and we're told that Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and whose face adorns Mount Rushmore to this day, was a proponent of utilizing naval power. And indeed, naval power was considered one of the most threatening aspects to world peace, as there was the Washington Naval Treaty. Again, this is all the official history. Although isn't it odd that many of these treaties merely serve to encourage, or at least we're told encourage, more innovative approaches to military problems? Perhaps the most interesting aspect, though, in the change of power from the United Kingdom or Great Britain to the United States is just how seamlessly it seemed to happen. And you can really look closely at the development from the Spanish-American War in 1898 to the end of World War II in 1945, and really look at the official strength of the Navy and the military, and then also in what geographical areas both the nations were applied in. It went from the sun never sets on the British Empire to the sun never sets on the presence of the United States military. And whether it's a base or the vast naval presence of the United States military, that all seemed to have its incipience in the use of the Great White Fleet. And here you can see these were the ports of call, and isn't it odd that there weren't many ports of call in Europe at that time? Because you would think they would want to show off the Great White Fleet to nations such as the United Kingdom and Germany. And of course, we have no shortage of our great plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and the interesting historicity of the Great White Fleet, and where it was applied and where it wasn't applied. There's no shortage, though, of documentation and photographs and articles and plaques written about the Great White Fleet. It's quite intriguing. It's intriguing to think that the Great White Fleet occurred right after the World's Fairs. And now we look at technology. The technological developments of the 1800s are very intriguing. From photographs to telephone to the car, electric telegraph, the vast railway networks, especially in the United States, that the United States managed to apply more rail networks than any other nation, and x-rays, underground railroads, sewing machines, rubber tires, and of course, the public flushing toilet. So you see right there all these technological innovations in the 1800s which brought about modern life. Now, of course, we have some other looks at history that suggest that perhaps there were more technological innovations. Now, there's no official documentation of a television from the 1800s, but it should be noted that there are a lot of rumors of it. State capitals, 1800 to 1899. And we've done many explorations of state capitals, and I always find it interesting that nearly half the states in the United States still have their original state capitals from the 1800s. And they're very gorgeous and impressive buildings, and they're standing quite well to this day. And there seems to be no issue with the maintenance of these buildings, although we'll have conflicting accounts in terms of how well constructed they were. Apparently there was no issue with building a beautiful state capitol in Denver, Colorado in the mountains in the 1800s, and it still stands to this day. We've looked at the Capitol in Connecticut, another one of the most beautiful ones, and in my humble opinion, it compares very closely with what we consider as building number one in our explorations here on this channel. But when you look across at all these different state capitals and you see the similar designs, it's intriguing to think that all these state capitals were built at the same time as many of the county courthouses across the land, with very intricate construction and great details, such as the state capitol here in Springfield, Illinois. And was Springfield the home of the Simpsons? I don't know. They made several allusions to it. We'll have an upcoming exploration on that one. There's state capitals everywhere, though, that give you the impression of great portal windows, wondrous domes, and very interesting construction material. When you go to assess it, you'll be told it's a combination of sandstone, limestone, and of course, I couldn't resist throwing in building number one, the Iowa State Capitol. Even its construction material is quite intriguing, and when you view it on the inside, you definitely get the feeling that you're not in any sort of state capitol, but you're in a palace. And wherever you look at these state capitals, you'll see the similar construction stylings, the pediment, the dome, the great columns, the pillars that are built in the wall, and then of course they're always on hills. And wherever you are in the land, you'll find that there's never any shortage of the construction capabilities. There are certain aspects that match, and yet there are many nuances that show off in many of these wondrous state capitals. And keep in mind, we're looking at only the state capitals that were specifically constructed in the 1800s. We have a couple beauties that were supposedly constructed in the 1700s, and then we have quite a few in the early 1900s. And yet they all seem to be constructed from the same time frame when you compare some of them. And it's very odd that the ability to lay out these wondrous state capitals seemed to end for good around the 1930s, although really you could say it was around the 1920s. New York State Capitol is always very interesting, as you would expect to see a traditional dome, and we don't have that. We have what looks to be a wonderful mansion, or maybe another home for the Vanderbilts. I'm just saying it looks that way, I'm not suggesting that. And yet, wherever you are in the land, you can always find that these state capitals from the 1800s are going to endure for all time, and they give great inspiration in terms of their construction capabilities, whether they have a dome on top or not, or a pediment, or they're slightly different styles. There are different styles when it comes to the 1800s, and yet so many things that seem to be the same. It's a complex situation of similar architecture, and yet we're supposed to believe that all this occurred in the 1800s, along with all the great courthouses. And let's not forget the wondrous state capitol in Austin, Texas, something that quite frankly exceeds the capital of the United States, not just in terms of its space, but its location, its overall beauty. And wherever you look, whether you're in the smaller states of Vermont or New Hampshire, you'll see that the same stylings of the state capitol are not lost. And even in Wyoming, when they just had cowboys and settlers and prospectors, they were still able to design and erect a very impressive state capitol. And I'm sure there's no shortage of talented architects to be found. The World's Fairs from 1851 through 1900. The World's Fairs are one of the interesting elements of exploration that we do when it comes to this alternative research, because these represent the fact that something strange was going on in the 1800s. Yes, the telescope from the Chicago World's Fair, which to this day you can still go and see in an observatory off Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, where it ended up. We have many wonderful showcasings of buildings from these World's Fairs and odd enough exhibitions of great technology, because even though this was nascent technology, it seems as though the people managed to adapt very quickly. The beautiful Crystal Palace, the mobile Crystal Palace from the original World's Fair. Yes, quite intriguing that they managed to produce all this glass in a record amount of time, and then they managed to move it because building it wasn't good enough. Gotta give Great Britain credit though. All their wondrous old world infrastructure, it's mobile. But unfortunately, the Crystal Palace is no longer with us, as it caught fire in the 1930s, and we'll be doing an exploration where we're going to look a lot more closely at this particular Crystal Palace. How exactly does a structure such as this catch on fire? Well, just don't ask, okay? We just know it happens. And here you can see the unfortunate devastated remnants of the Crystal Palace, although it looks like the tower came off pretty nicely. I wonder why they tore down the tower. Well, because the main structure was gone. The gold rushes of 1849, 1896, gold rushes to California, gold rushes to Alaska, the Klondike, the Yukon, all the unique areas that seem to draw vast amounts of people. I wonder why we don't have gold rushes to this day. Oh, that's right, we don't need to have gold rushes. We have cryptocurrency rushes, and you can just do those from the comfort of your own computer. You don't need to get on a really uncomfortable boat and go to some unfortunate area that has no development whatsoever and no logistical capacity and decide to go prospecting for gold. And indeed, the official history tells us that no one came up successful when they were looking for gold. But we do have these interesting photos that show this vast arrival of ships in ports such as San Francisco. Now, let's just think about this. Is this exactly what's really happening? Are we really looking at all these prospectors who filled up San Francisco Bay in a very short amount of time? Or was something else being depicted here? A vast arrival of many people from some other area for another reason. And Gold Rush just happened to be a nice little way to explain it. Because even if you had a gold rush, don't you think people would be thinking about the fact that, I'm going to go to an area that is unsettled, uncivilized from my perspective, and look for gold. I mean, granted, Al Bundy did it in the 1980s, and it wasn't too successful, and it turned out that he was merely prospecting for fool's gold. Now let's look at blizzards and freezes of the 1800s, and we talked about earlier how the climate, the environment seemed to change a lot through the 1800s. Officially, we're told that things improved and warmed up through the 1800s, but then we have conflicting accounts of vast blizzards and great freezes, and it wasn't just the year without the summer in 1816. We even have one as late as 1899, where we have vast amounts of snow and very unseasonable cold temperatures that buried many of the cities in the Northeast and even brought strife to the cities in the southern United States, all the way down to Florida, where they were certainly not used to snowfall, and indeed the first image we looked at was snowfall in Florida. Many feet of snow fell, and it wasn't confined to the mountain resorts of Nevada or Lake Tahoe to this day, but they were all over the place. And why is it we have these recurring themes of vast amounts of snowfall? Did this reflect something else? Now, I know I haven't included the Carrington event in this particular series of explorations, and by all means did I not say that this exploration was comprehensive of all the strange events of the 1800s. Let's be honest, there were thousands. But we'll be looking at the Carrington event in a separate exploration because it is quite interesting, and we're told officially it didn't have many historical impacts, and yet other indications show that it did. Back to the weather, though, we can see how the weather affected, at least we're told, the United States especially. And yet again, despite all these great challenges, the loss of many oranges in Florida because of the weather issues, somehow the nation seemed to survive and continue to progress. And indeed, this was at the time when the United States became a world power, because this last blizzard in 1899 certainly didn't stop any of the great advances that the nation was making, and it did not impede its ability to take its stage with the world, especially when it came to World War I, where the introduction of American troops towards the end, we're told, was decisive to bringing about the Allies' final victory. So you have it, many great conflicting events from the 1800s, many strange events that give cause to question exactly what was going on and why. Many people have looked at the 1800s before, and it's a very odd time frame. And indeed, if a time frame that is so recent, at least in the grand scheme of the overall passage of time, has so many questions about it, then we really have to consider, where else do we have questions? What was real and what wasn't real? What happened and what didn't happen? Now, of course, if we consult the mainstream, they have answers for this, and they're going to tell us that we should not be thinking independently about this. And how exactly would the mainstream respond to these separate investigations, these explorations? Well, I think we should consider that to close this particular exploration. How does the mainstream respond to what we do with our alternative exploration? Well, this article might provide some insight. 1800s technology conspiracies behind the era of invention. And here we have the image of the individual in the 1800s looking at a television. Very fascinating. But we're told that it's known as the Age of Progress, the 1800s, the Second Industrial Revolution. I'm surprised we don't have 8 industrial revolutions, to be honest with you. However, a growing trend of conspiracy theories surrounding these inventions prompts intriguing discussions. So they do admit that this is intriguing and compelling. And they talk about the invention of the light bulb, and then they talk about the debate between Hiram Maxim and Thomas Edison. But then they say that Maxim himself, who said he invented the light bulb, was a controversial figure, because Thomas Edison is most certainly not a controversial figure. And by the way, remember, he did invent a version of Portland cement that was very, very useful in constructing certain stadiums, and we explored that in the past. Tesla's wireless electricity suppressed technology. And of course, they detail the efforts of Nikola Tesla to provide wireless technology, but then they say that there were many great obstacles to this wireless technology. Of course, there were no practical obstacles to all the other developments in the 1800s, such as the telegraph or the rapid construction of railroads, where none had existed. And when you can move 11,000 miles of track in 36 hours and change the gauge on it, why would there be any practical obstacles? Certainly not. The telephone patent race, and then finally our conclusion, decoding the conspiracy. While these 19th century technology conspiracy theories are captivating, they often reflect our own insecurities about technological control and credit more than they reveal about historical fact. Ah, yes, it's your own insecurities when you question things. That's why. The development of technology is rarely a linear path traced to a single individual. Rather, it's a collective endeavor. Oh, except when it comes to Edison, then it's a single individual, but I digress. By scrutinizing these conspiracies, we can better understand the complex social dynamics that shape technological progress. Yet it's crucial to separate sensational speculation, and you might notice that speculation and well-documented are two of the buzz terms we hear a lot, from nuanced historical understanding to truly appreciate the fascinating history of 1800s technological innovations. So in other words, things are only impossible until they're not, just like Captain Picard said. Well, let's take a look, because we have history and science and the two tend to run together. One of the responses that I received in a reply on the 1980s exploration is one of the elements that showed how far we've come in technological progress since 1980 when Carl Sagan did Cosmos was the detection of exoplanets. Carl Sagan had teased it in Cosmos in the 1980s, and I just thought we would look at how science tells us they actually detect exoplanets. Because are we actually able to see planets in other solar systems that are 25 trillion miles away? And by the way, that's the nearest solar system. And again, that's what science tells us. And what are the techniques that they use? Well, they have the wobbling star that hints at an exoplanet presence. The first planets found orbiting sun-like stars are detected by radial velocity technique. A single star devoid of a planetary system will have its center of gravity located at the center of the star. However, when a planet orbits a star, the center of gravity of the star-planet system becomes offset from the center of the star, causing the star to wobble. That's right. If you see a wobbly star, then it may have planets around it. Now, of course, we don't actually see these planets directly, but we can see a little bit of a wobble in a star. That's 25 trillion miles, and that's the nearest one, or many, many more, because 25 trillion miles is about 4.3 light years. Again, going off what the science tells us. There must be more techniques to detect exoplanets. Astrometry is the method that detects the motion of a star by making precise measurements of its position in the sky. Again, 25 trillion miles or more. This technique can be used to identify planets around a star by measuring tiny changes in the star's position as it wobbles around the center of mass of the planetary system. So again, we don't actually see the planets. We see how the star or the light is affected. And from that, scientists are able to ascertain that there are planets around the star. Because there's no other subspace anomalies out there or random other reasons for why there might be variances in the starlight or these wobbly effects that we have. Look, this is science. They are telling us the truth, and it's very clear that this is not speculation when they show us these images of these planets. Even though they don't actually see the planets, they see the changes in the light from the stars, what we're told. And it should be noted that this is the difference between rampant speculation, which is what we're doing when we actually question what we're told, as opposed to good science and good history. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.